Welcome to the EarthWorks podcast, where our team will share the jargon of carbon from many of our turf friends from the past 30 years.
Hello all, and welcome to the EarthWorks podcast. This week, I'm your host, Jack Higgins, and I am very pleased that we have a wonderful guest joining us, Mr. Joe Belmonte of Environmental Construction Solutions. Joe, thanks for coming on.
Thanks. Really glad to be here. Heard your podcast before, Jack, and known you for a while and looking forward to today.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. I mean, so the podcast really goes out into the turf and horticulture, turf and ornamental industry. But I think a lot of the theme that we're going to discuss today is that land management really kind of intersects with of course golf courses and sports fields and lawn care and everything. What you do is very similar, but it's kind of in a separate industry. However, we're going to show how they're very much the same.
They really are. They really are. You know, you're really talking about land management, and you're talking about figuring out the soils that you're working with and trying to, establish vegetation. In my world, it's to help slow down and control erosion, erosion control. And when you control the water leaving a site in construction, you're trying to control the erosion and the sediment. And then after construction, even that vegetation helps to with the stormwater as it leaves the site. So there's really a lot of similarities for sure. The first thing that jumps out at me is having worked in both turf and erosion control over the years, is that a lot of companies or reps that work with these customers, they have a lot of the same arrows in the quiver, if you know what I mean, a lot of the same products.
Mm-hmm.
And we're working on larger sites like solar farms and industry sectors like energy and infrastructure, and really anywhere somebody's building something, even the home building market as people disturb land.
Sure. And I think a lot of our golf course superintendent listeners will grab onto this, because a lot of them have been involved in major land construction projects themselves, and have to work with engineers and consultants on exactly what you're talking about, the way the water sheds off of that land, what's in that watershed, everything like that.
Correct. And a lot really of what I do is work with our reps that are out there working with contractors kind of in the trenches, and I'm a liaison a lot of times between those guys and the engineers and the contractors on site, and trying to figure out the right products and help them really determine what's what for their day-to-day grind, if that makes sense. So yeah, it's very similar when you get into that.
Yeah, that does make sense, and that brings up an interesting point. I think you described your role pretty well, that you're really a liaison, a go-between, and in that you've been a large part of bridging this T&O industry into the construction industry, into this which, like you mentioned, includes the energy sector, the infrastructure sector, and you've shown how we can bridge the gap from our kind of little niche industry into something that the scope of what you're talking about is really massive. And now we're talking about giant projects that really affect the entire community, the entire country, and I think that's really cool. That's a lot of what I want to get into today, really trying to show the scope of what you're doing out there.
What we're doing, yeah. For instance, in the Mid-Atlantic, where I primarily work, there's a big solar boom right now, and we're working on a lot of solar farms, some of them 2,000 and 3,000 acres. So that's a pretty huge, plot of land that's being disturbed, and they're taking, sometimes 2 to 3 years to get built. So it's really quite interesting, and to see a lot of these construction folks get into different types of products. Really, a lot more in your world is kind of the organics, and putting them into the soil. And what's interesting about that is that a lot of states' regulations are, I hate to say it, but a bit antiquated. Some of the erosion and control handbooks are 20 and 30 years old since they've been updated for any number of reasons. And you have a lot of engineers that have traditionally just cut and paste specs from those industry standards. And it's typically been something like, you put out temporary seeding or permanent seeding, and you're putting out a little bit of lime, to raise the pH, and you're putting out something like a basic 10-10-10 granular fertilizer. And so as the need for sustainability and the drive for sustainability has kind of grown in the last, decade or two, really also coupled with the increase in the rise of products, because costs are going up and the fuel prices are going up, in general, and the cost it takes to get something to a project, that's driven cost up. So where contractors have traditionally used just basically the same thing from the 50s to the 70s and 80s in a lot of regards with growing grass and growing vegetation, they're finally starting to look at a better mousetrap, because they want to do it better the first time so they don't have to go back. And they realize that a little more, input in the budget from the beginning will in fact save money in the long term. So we're seeing a big part of that.
Well, okay, so you mentioned something that you say they want to do it better for the first time so they don't have to go back. In your experience, does that happen a lot? Has that happened a lot?
It does. When you're a job site doesn't necessarily have an annual plan, like a golf course or a football field or a soccer pitch. When you go out and you've got bare dirt, the contractor's trying to get it to a point where he can get his NOT or notice of termination, or basically get off the site and get paid. Different states have different names for that sort of thing. So, they want to get that vegetation established and that cover established so that the erosion control inspectors and the state inspectors can improve them. So yeah, again, a lot of that has also increased in the last, few decades, because just the growth of commercial industries in general, and people are seeding at all times of the year, if that makes sense. Whereas, years ago, they would easily revolve a project where they could seed in the spring or fall. And now they're seeding in the summer with a nurse crop, or sometimes seeding in the winter, trying to establish vegetation or get it started for the spring. So there is a lot of that, trying to, like we said, build a better mousetrap, or get out there and do things once and done, because typically what they'll do is they'll leave the site, and depending on their contract, they may or may not have to come back. And, you're obviously on something as big as 2,000 acres, you're going to have some areas that you have to be seeded again, because any number of reasons. Let's say it didn't take very well, or there was something in that plot of soil that they missed in the soil test, or it could be that something in construction, they thought they were done and they had to go back and move some things around. And then you talk about compaction or moving dirt around, and you've got a couple acres before you finish that you've got to do again. But generally, once a contractor leaves, depending on his contract, there may be somebody else, monitoring that site. And it goes from erosion and sediment control in the construction phase to more of the stormwater regulations in what we call the post-construction phase.
Oh, very interesting.
Yeah.
Let's dial back a little bit, and you mentioned like a 2,000 acre job. How does that start? Let's talk about from the landowner. Let's say this was a farmer that was farming corn and soy, and decides, I'm done with this, and I want my land to go into a solar field.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of that going on in different parts of the world, obviously, and so the solar companies get with the landowners basically, and create the blueprint, working with engineers to what they're going to do with the land, the civil engineers as to how they're going to move the dirt and lay out the land, and then obviously that's who we deal with mostly, but there's also electrical engineers, with the actual solar panels, there's other types of, I'm sure there's chemical engineers involved with pipelines and other facilities there, might have different things that folks work on. But with us, it's you take a solar farm, for example, because we're talking about just moving that much dirt. It starts from kind of the top down, being solar company and landowner get together. Then it has to get approved. It has to get approved by the state, and it also has to get approved by the local municipality. So the local board of supervisors, and depending on where you are in the world, sometimes counties and municipalities are very pro solar, and other times they're not.
Sure.
So once that happens, then it goes out to bid for the construction, and eventually it's built. And so the energy essentially goes back into the grid, and that happens by a number of ways. Sometimes the company owns the actual solar farm and then sells the power to a power company. Other time, the company will build the solar farm and kind of sell the whole thing to a Duke Energy or Dominion Power or something like that. So there's a wide array of how that all happens. But generally, from the standpoint of our business, we're looking at projects that are starting immediately and trying to get involved with them. And then a lot of what I do is with the engineers, is work on the design side of projects that are coming down the pike.
So when it comes now moving more towards as it relates to us in the soil, land, vegetation management, as a project comes to you, what are the sort of things that you're considering, the variables that you're considering for a particular site, and
Right.
how you can make that successful?
Well, there's a lot of things outside of soil and fertility that we're into also, that, if some of your T&O guys have worked on the construction of a golf course, there's things like silk fence, construction fabrics. There's all sorts of products that you use in ravines or channel ditches, inlet protection,
Right.
to kind of capture the sediment as it leads off-site. Then there's a lot of products that can kind of replace riprap and things like straw blankets and anything in that side of the industry. But what's specific to
Like, I'm talking about the specific type of vegetation, what
we're looking for,
and what
Sure.
where you're actually growing. I imagine you're growing in between and underneath solar panels.
We are. So we're doing that. And so a lot of what we talk about from the get-go with engineers or with contractors are soil testing and trying to work with the soil test. That's the biggest thing. A lot of folks will basically go back to that old E&S handbook and just, plant what's in there, or use the ingredients that are listed in the state handbook, and that's pretty antiquated. So we're using, like, sometimes native seeds on these big projects. Sometimes We're using reclamation mixes. Reclamation mixes are not native, but they're things like fescues, red top, clover. One of the ironies we talk about on our side of the business is that our warehouses, are full of dicamba and three-way herbicides for folks that want to eradicate clover, and 2 shelves over, there's literally 50-pound bags of inoculated clover that we're trying to get into a job site, because white clover is a wonderful thing on an erosion control stand. It's a legume. It pumps atmospheric nitrogen back into the soil.
Absolutely.
The stolons really hold the soil well on a hillside.
Okay.
So we're trying to determine what to plant and where. And interestingly enough, a lot of states have kind of programs that are really pushing that now from the sustainable side of native seeds and pollinators, and to kind of protect the bees, and with the whole bee thing going on, which is really cool and really I think worthwhile. But so a lot of states will have a native seed component that they want to see used, or that states or excuse me, sites can get kind of a checklist or things like that if they use a certain amount of native seeds, and or a certain amount of pollinators, and create a pollinator friendly environment.
Okay,
so that's really what we're looking for, of kind of what we plan and when.
I'm thinking in my head of all the different environmental benefits that you're talking about, the cascading environmental benefits of a solar farm like this. Of course, we're harvesting sun's energy, and
Right.
we're not burning fossil fuel, and we're turning it into electricity. B,
Exactly.
we're building topsoil with these species and plants that pump carbon into the ground and remineralize the ground, like you mentioned with the legumes. And then C, something I hadn't even considered, that there's a huge pollinator impact if you're planting plants that the bees and other pollinators can come and visit, as opposed to the row crop, which they're not only are they not getting anything, but they're also getting sprayed out.
Right. Very true. Very true. Agriculture as a whole, I think, is one of the more sustainable things we've ever done. When you can think about the fact that how many people the American farmer can feed with the amount of land that he's farming. And, they're really one of the most interesting groups of folks that I know. I grew up and live still in a very rural agricultural county. But we have started to understand that a lot of row crop farming is kind of depletes the soil a little bit, and even it sometimes brings about more erosion. And so you're right, these solar farms, and even more than that, sometimes a pipeline that goes through a farm field,
Sure.
is organic matter is put in temporarily, and some more vegetative species are put in temporarily over that right of way. And then a year later, when the power line is rehabbed or built, the farmer actually can,
Come
in
back.
that instance, can grow row crops under it. But back to solar, you're exactly right. There's just a huge opportunity there to really try and replenish the soil, get the pollinator habitat great. Pollinators are great for bees, but not only bees, but for small insects and birds. The solar farm is interesting, and because part of the panels underneath it are in shade all of the time, and then the rows in between get sunlight all of the time. And then some of the solar panels, depending on the newer solar farms, they actually rotate with the sun. So then you have a certain amount of space in that site that is actually shaded part of the day and direct sunlight part of the day. So from a turf and ornamental standpoint, thinking about that, I mean, you've got to find a mix of species that will do well in sunlight, shade, partial shade, any number of things. It does create quite a challenge. And one of the interesting things in talking to engineers is that if you go in and do a lunch and learn at an engineer's office, which I do a lot, or talk to them on webinars,
Sure.
sometimes you'll ask, how many of you took a soil science class in college? And most of them over 50 really don't raise their hand. That's kind of amazing. The engineering community and younger are starting to learn that, and starting to take soil science classes. But the folks that are doing this over 50, they've been literally, I don't want to say destroying the land, but they've been moving the dirt around for years and years to create and build things, but yet they didn't take a soil science class. So that's kind of an interesting scenario.
I'd say you're right. I mean, I think the perspective is different. Like, they're thinking of it more as just moving bricks around, as opposed to that what they're moving around is actually a living, breathing entity. Really, it's a huge community of living, breathing entities in the soil. So yeah, I meant these are like civil engineers, right?
Correct.
Okay, got it. Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
And we're starting to see too, more and more of them kind of take note of those things. It's great that they're starting to consider things like the pollinators and having an understanding. But we a lot of times we talk to them, and I start my presentation off with a picture of a football field.
mm-hmm.
And your turf guys will appreciate this. And so if I'm in Virginia, I'll put up Virginia Tech. If I'm in North Carolina, I'll put up NC State, because typically the engineers did go to the ag school, a lot of them.
Absolutely. They
And I'll
went to
say,
the big
what
land
is
school.
what does your football field have in common with your job site? And they kind of think a minute. And then, I go into how that guy uses, it's a Bermuda-based field, and then they overseed with annual or perennial ryegrass because of the cool season and warm season things. And I start to equate that to a job site and time of year and planning and what to plan and using a nurse crop. And it really, it kind of grabs their attention because, they've all been back to, their alma mater's football game in the mid-Atlantic or the Southeast, where we work mostly. In the last few years. So it's an interesting dynamic when they see it in an analogy like that they can grab onto. They're pretty interested.
So a question. Now I have solar panels on my roof here, and I know that there's a lifespan. It's really, I actually, you talked about the different kind of financial deals that are worked out. I have a lease deal. I didn't pay for anything to put them on. But all the excess energy that they're earning goes back to the company that owns them, really. Right. Which is all fine. I save money on my electrical bill, all good, and I get to have solar panels on my roof. I'm proud of it. But so, like I said, it's a 20-year deal, and the panels, the panels start to lose they start to lose efficiency after 20 years. Now, I imagine that there's end games for these fields out there. Do they talk in these projects about how the project ends decades from now?
They do. They have a bonding system where they have a bond in place that actually works with the deconstruction of the farm. Or even on a pipeline or an old landfill or any of the other what I would call reclamation type things that we're working on with these pollinator mixes and reclamation mixes, they're typically have a bond involved so that if let's say in 20 years, if the contractor isn't around anymore, or if it falls to the hands of the municipality, there's money in a bond to take care of that. And that's a lot of the concern of the municipalities or the rural areas, where these solar farms are, a lot of folks that are primarily agricultural are, losing farmland to these solar farms, and they're worried about, what if XYZ company's not around in 20 years? And so you're right. That's a good question, but that's all built into the beginning. And that bond is based on an engineer's budget of what it would cost to deconstruct all of that. And that's revisited every 5 years typically. And that money kind of goes, is in most cases is raised up front as part of the project, and is put in I guess some sort of escrow, until the end of the project.
So I see that as being a concern for the people that live in that area, that they want to know what's going to happen, or the landowner, if they're still owning the land, what's going to happen. But I also could see that from our side of things, from your side of things, and anybody that's in land management and soil management, that what you're doing over that period of time, say 2 decades, with the species that you're growing in this soil is actually in that time going to totally replenish the topsoil. So decades of farming, maybe centuries of farming in some of these situations can that have pulled mineral and carbon out of the ground,
Yeah.
all to the like you say, all to the benefit of the country. Like
Right.
like this agriculture, I'm giving it a bad rap, but it feeds America, it feeds the
Sure.
world. But there was a cost, and the cost often was depleting the soil.
Correct.
2020.
You're right. And it's not
Well,
only farming, it's anytime dirt is moved. Oftentimes you take if you live in a subdivision or live near a subdivision, typically that topsoil is, stripped away. They build everything, all the houses, and then they put sod right over kind of the lower, level of the soil, and sell the house and leave. And then the homeowner is dealt with trying to, they think, well, I'm just not watering it enough. And the sod is not doing well because it doesn't have a good layer of topsoil underneath it. So everything, we're putting it in the framework, right, of the solar boom that's kind of happening, but really these in agriculture, because it's replacing a lot of that, but really this kind of, unrelenting unreplenishment of soils has been happening in all forms of construction for years. And a lot of what we talk about is starting to put some of that carbon back with organic fertilizer or compost or any number of things. We start to see that move again, not from a governmental side with regulations, but from a standpoint of the free market side, because people understand that it works. And that's what's really interesting.
Bingo.
To it, to me. And so you're exactly right. I mean, you're exactly right. Those varieties and species, or, some native varieties have a 2 to 3 foot root structure. I mean, you're definitely replenishing the soil. And as folks are starting to see on a more 10,000 foot level,
Sure.
folks that have been in this for the longest time and starting to talk about it, they're really understanding that it's something we need, and people are jumping on this. I don't want to call it a bandwagon, but jumping on this kind of soil first idea, or let's take care of our soil. And a lot of us talk about the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, and I can't remember where I heard it. It was at a trade show or something, but somebody said, and there's been talk of, what we need is a Clean Soil Act.
Bingo.
And
Bingo.
I think that was, I think that would be pretty interesting.
I think it's been broached before, and it's actually come up in these podcasts before. Talking with golf course superintendent. There was a sweeping farm bill in 2018 that made some major changes, and in that they broached the subject of are there credits available to farmers that are building their soil? Is there something available? Is there some note for someone that is going to replenish topsoil as opposed to strip topsoil? So right. I'm thinking about this in the same way a farmer rotates fields, just on a bigger rotation, that, you can move the solar panels, move the solar farm into the next field now this 2,000 acres has, the Great Plains worth of topsoil,
right,
3 feet down into the ground.
Yeah.
So you mentioned just, in general, and we can get into the specifics of this now, about the type of soil that everyone's tasked to deal with when it comes to whether it's growing these more pasture type species underneath the solar panels, or it's like you said, like in a subdivision that you're. What happens, and you mentioned this, is that the top horizons are really stripped off, and you're left with subsoil that is great for making clay bricks, but it's not necessarily great for growing plants. And what's missing is organic matter, mineral, particularly available phosphorus, and and then also there's a huge imbalance of the cations that are on that soil colloid that's way down, what could be 10, 20 feet below the surface of the earth. There's just not a good balance for biological life, because there is no biological life. There is no life down there. Yeah, it's just material at that point. It's not the environment for growing plants.
It is. It's clay, or in the mid-Atlantic, it may be a little more sandy on the eastern sides of the states, but you're exactly right. It's subsoil, and it's dinosaur dung, I guess.
That's exactly it. It's exactly it. Put it in a press and make bricks, but for growing plants, it doesn't necessarily work. And you mentioned, you're mentioning inserting that compost, inserting organic fertilizer like the EarthWorks products that will make a change quickly. But I like to emphasize that they do make a change quickly, but they're really the catalyst. They're the spark plug to make that change. Because what really is making the change over time, over years, decades, is life period. Correct. However, we need to get life started, right? And that's where this approach that they really haven't been using, but they're starting to use, understanding the soil test, adjusting their growing program to that soil test, and incorporating some spark plugs, some catalysts, some compost, some organic matter, to really get things going. And then let the species, let the plants, let the soil biology do its thing, because it'll happen.
For sure. I mean, typically the job sites that we see that are in that subsoil, when the topsoil has been stripped away, and we take a soil test, you're talking about a pH of below 5 most times. You're talking about minimal organic matter, less than 1%. Sure. You're talking about a very bad cation exchange capacity number, minimal phosphorus, or in some cases, the phosphorus is optimum or high on the soil test, but it's not available.
No, it's completely tied up.
It's completely tied up. And so, in doing that, something, a lot of what we've started to use is like an EarthWorks or a 3-2-3 in seeding, or even in conjunction sometimes with granular fertilizer. If inspectors say, no, you've got to use what's on the DOT regulations, like the 10-20-10. We've got folks that are buying several bags per acre of EarthWorks because they know it's going to work, and they know it's going to jumpstart things. And you're exactly right. And we're using a lot of these products too in hydroseeders.
That's what I find so interesting.
Your followers have probably seen the hydroseeders, but we deal with them every day. And they're really used extensively on a lot of these larger projects. And one of the things that they love about an EarthWorks product or a composted, based fertilizer is, as opposed to a traditional granular ag ferg, is that there's no, what it's made of, there's no rock or carrier in it. And, if you can imagine putting all this stuff into a hydroseeder, and there's a pump that, sprays it out, everything, that pump is something that they have to replace over time, and it wears down. And so the EarthWorks products it's really easy on their pump, because it's, there's no filler in that product. So a hydroseeder creates like a slurry, and with the water and the different types of hydromulches that are made to put in there. And then when you put the seed and the lime and a product like EarthWorks in there, that in the short amount of time that it's being kind of churned up in the hydroseeder, it's not going to dissolve in the tank, but it's going to get wet and go out on that subsoil, on that spot, and it really just works wonders with those bad soils.
Yeah, and starting vegetation quickly.
Yeah, exactly. And we even put it, our guys use a lot of drill seeders as well, large scale drill seeders behind larger tractors than you would probably see on a turf. Somebody that's, say, building a ball field or a golf course. I mean, a lot of them on these larger projects, or seeding companies are have a bigger machines. But it's interesting too, though. We talk about the kind of the products that are similar and how we use them, but a lot of the machinery is the same too, but just on a larger scale. And one of the things you'll appreciate is a lot of folks in my world know what an aerator is, but they don't know what an aerator is yet. And
Yes.
and they're in the solar world. A lot of the struggle is you build the panels and you have to go back in between where maybe they had to put up the panels in different places or compacted, and so they're trying to seed in between the panels once they're already up. And there's I've talked to solar companies and general contractors who had never heard of an aerator or I'm drawing a blank, man. The little tractor that you get the aerator attachment on the front of it. It's
Ventrac.
Ventrac. And so a
Yes.
lot of contractors now, and seeding contractors that are traveling around, working extensively on these farms, they've bought a Ventrac and an aerator.
It makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and they can go in and kind of deconstruct that compacted soil.
In between the rows. In
Yeah,
between the rows of panels, that must become a road. Like
exactly,
each one becomes a road, and now we're trying to grow into it after the electricians come through and every
panel
contract
guy and everything. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Okay, yeah, it makes perfect sense. And all of that then alleviates the runoff and the silt and everything, because that would be things that the community would be concerned about.
Correct. The things like silt fence and straw wattles and, all of those things that are put up in construction, remember that they're gone post-construction. So that's the importance of vegetation on a job site is that, it's got to dissipate the rain enough to stop real erosion. Even if you're in an area that's relatively flat, where a large pipeline or solar farm is, or you've got sheet flow that can create erosion if there's no vegetation in there relatively quickly. And so that's the importance of getting that vegetation up and going, permanent vegetation before that contractor leaves.
Sure. And we can see we've seen in quick amount of time. I've been in the industry really for about 15 years or so. And in this time, the fertilizer laws were around the Chesapeake Bay were put into place. And also within this time, they've seen the benefit from them. Like,
correct.
They've seen the health of the bay get better in less than a decade.
Right.
And I can imagine, those are the reasons then why we take this seriously. We don't want 2,000 acres of silt to run into the watershed and out into the bay, because with that comes all of this phosphorus, all of this material. We say the phosphorus is bound in the soil. It's really unbound by biological life. Well, you'll get that in the bay, and then you'll have an algae bloom, and no one wants that.
Right. Exactly. And so there's you've got to get your erosion control measures and your vegetation correct, so that when you leave, your stormwater that is running off the site is clean. And that's a lot of, you may have heard of a SWIP or SWIP plan, and that's an SWPPP plan. That's a stormwater pollution and prevention plan.
Okay, I did not know that.
In most states, there's something like that, whether it's called that or not, that a contractor has to have while he's building, but also, if you're disturbing land over so many acres, you've got to have that in place and monitored. And, that doesn't go away when construction stops. I mean, that's one of the driving factors behind, monitoring your stormwater and what we call sediment basins and sediment ponds that you will see around construction sites. they become, most of them become stormwater ponds, so they're still there, but they're a way to let water kind of dissipate off the site and go into that stormwater pond, and the sediment can actually settle to the bottom before it's released out into the local waterways or streams. So there's all sorts of design criteria that you can work around that. But
now let's talk about how this is all kind of networked globally. There's a governmental side of things. I mean, I'm thinking in my head, I know that they just passed a big infrastructure bill federally.
yeah,
I imagine that and I know that there's always incentives for gaining more green based energy. I imagine that a lot of that stimulus makes its way to these projects.
They do. Most states have a renewable energy kind of mandate, if you will, or number that they want to be at in the next 10 to 15 years. Each state is a little different, and that's driving a lot of the design of a lot of these projects, whether it be solar. There's still pipeline rehab and pipeline work. A lot of the pipeline, some of the pipelines you see in the news were actually, canceled or done away with, but there's still pipelines that were designed and built years ago that are being built, and not only that, being upkept, and there's things to go on with that. But you're right, a lot of the solar incentive that is based on renewable energy and things of that nature, and different states have tax credits. And then you also have where municipalities get involved on that, is turning old lands into solar farms. So maybe it's like an old mining reclamation site, or an old landfill that's been capped, and you're talking about 300 or 400 acres that is just kind of sitting there. That is not, you can't build anything on it, obviously. It's just being monitored from an environmental and a stormwater perspective. Well, there's a big move in most states to try to get renewable energy placed in those areas.
And again, when they do that, it's seemingly it's really a secondary benefit. But when they get the solar panels up, or they use that land for some sort of energy sector, infrastructure sector, they use the land for a primary reason. The auxiliary benefit is that they can rebuild the soil there.
Absolutely. I mean, even on a mine site or a landfill that's been it has vegetation on it. Let's say it's been hasn't been used in years. You're gonna turn that up, or you're gonna compact that, or you're gonna have to move that around and replant vegetative species once you go in there and build those things, because of what happens during construction. So you're right. I mean, it's just an opportunity to enhance the soil, to enhance the topsoil layer, and build that back on any construction site, by using something like an EarthWorks product to get the vegetation up and established.
Yeah, it makes perfect
sense. Get that
sense.
carbon back in the soil, as you like.
Yeah, sure. And get it established quickly.
Right.
That's the idea. We want these projects to go over smoothly, as they should. There's enough hiccups with everything else. Let's not the vegetation establishment be a hiccup for the engineers and the construction companies that are doing this work. Joe, I think that we've kind of broached a lot of what I wanted to, and really gained some perspective as to how there is this crossover in land, water, soil management, on the construction side, these giant projects, that there is this crossover into the turf and ornamental industry. And
absolutely.
It's really cool that our industry has this to offer to what are now giant, nationally impactful projects, for the country, for the world.
It is. And a lot of that is born, a lot of what we're dealing with, the progress we've seen, is born out of the turf and ornamental world, through what, that side of the industry is doing, and where a lot of the research is generated, from the same typically ag-based schools in states that are, have civil engineering design.
Yeah, I'm proud of all of our alma maters, and
Yeah.
of our shared industries, that we're making this sort of impact. I think it's really,
It is.
I think it's something that we can all be very proud of.
It is.
Joe, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Yeah, man, really enjoyed it. Good catching up as always, and really glad to be a part of this, man.
Oh, great. Well, we appreciate it very much too. You were an excellent guest, and I think very enlightening.
Thanks. I appreciate it.
All right, Joe, all the best.
Yeah, you too. We'll talk soon. Thanks, Jack.